Where Are They Now? Adult video performers, written by Barron Darby, narrated by Jessica Ann Bogart. There is a particular kind of fame that burns hot and then seems to vanish. For a few years, a face is everywhere, on magazine covers, on the marquees of theaters that no longer exist, on the spines of video cassettes that once lined the back rooms of every video store in America. And then the moment passes. The industry moves on to new faces. The culture moves on to new scandals, and the people who were, briefly, among the most recognized performers in a multi-billion-dollar business, become a trivia question whispered at a party. Whatever happened to her? Whatever became of him? This book is an attempt to answer that question honestly and with respect. The adult film industry has always existed in a strange double light. For decades, it was both wildly popular and deeply stigmatized, watched by millions and acknowledged by almost no one. The performers at its center lived inside that contradiction. They were famous and invisible at the same time. Their faces were known to enormous audiences who would never have admitted to knowing them. And when their time in front of the cameras ended, most of them had to build entirely new lives in a world that often refused to forget what they had once done for a living. What is remarkable, when you actually look, is how many of them did exactly that. The pages that follow tell the stories of more than 30 people who came up through the adult film industry. From the so-called golden age of the 1970s, all the way through the internet era of the 2000s, and what they made of the decades, or the years, that came after. Some became mainstream actors. One became an attorney in her 50s. Several became authors with genuine bestsellers to their names. Others became broadcasters, directors, company founders, real estate agents, nurses, educators, artists, and activists. A few became cautionary tales. Some are no longer with us, and their stories are told here as a record of lives that mattered. Because that messier reality is the point. The cliché of the Where Are They Now story is the rise and the fall, the bright flame and the sad ending. Real lives rarely cooperate with that shape. The people in this book got married and divorced, raised children, buried spouses, fought addictions, won awards, went to prison, went back to school, found religion, lost it, started companies, sold companies, and grew old. They did, in other words, what everyone does. They just did it while carrying a past that most people will never have to explain at a job interview or a parent-teacher conference. It is worth pausing on the word stigma, because it is the invisible weather system over every life in this book. Most of us are allowed to be many things across a lifetime. We change jobs, change cities, change our minds, and the world lets the old versions of us fade. The people in these pages were rarely granted that ordinary mercy. For them, one chapter, often a short one, often filmed when they were very young, was treated as the whole book. To reinvent yourself under those conditions is harder than it sounds, and the fact that so many here managed it is the quiet drama running underneath every profile. You will notice that the book is organized by decade, because the industry these people entered was not one fixed thing. The performers of the 1970s came up in an almost respectable cultural moment and often had backgrounds in theater and publishing. The performers of the 1980s rode the explosion of home video into a far larger and more anonymous kind of fame. The performers of the 1990s became brands, and the smartest of them treated their own names as assets to be managed. The performers of the 2000s and 2010s came up as the internet dissolved the old walls entirely, until they could narrate their own lives in real time to audiences larger than any film had reached. Several eras, several different machines for making and unmaking fame, and several different sets of doors that opened or didn't when the work was over. A note, too, on who is not in this book. For every person profiled in these pages, there are countless others who left the industry and asked, in effect, to be left alone, who built quiet lives under their own names, far from any spotlight, and who never chose to speak publicly about their pasts. This book makes no attempt to find them, name them, or tell their stories. The absence is deliberate, and in its way, central to the project's ethics. The people you will meet here are the ones who open the door themselves. Everyone who chose to keep it closed has every right to, and that right is honored by silence. You may also notice that this book resists ranking its subjects. It would be easy to arrange these lives into a hierarchy, most successful to least, most famous to most obscure, biggest triumph to saddest end. But that instinct is exactly the one the book is trying to unlearn. A woman who became an attorney and a woman who quietly sold real estate are not competitors. A person who built a company worth millions and a person who chose a private life out of the public eye did not win and lose. They made different lives out of different materials, under a kind of pressure most of us will never face. The point is not to score them. The point is to see them. Read this, then, as a book about second acts, about what it takes to be defined by the most exposed years of your life, and then to define yourself again, on your own terms. The cameras stop, the lights go down, and then, for most of the people in these pages, in ways almost no one bothered to report at the time, the actual life begins. Part 1. The 1970s. Porno chic. For a brief, strange stretch in the early 1970s, adult film was almost respectable. It was the era the press christened porno chic, when a handful of explicit features broke out of the back rooms and into ordinary movie theaters, when they were reviewed in mainstream newspapers, and when going to see one became, for a certain slice of the culture, a daring night on the town. Films like Deep Throat and The Devil and Miss Jones were discussed at cocktail parties and on talk shows. For a moment, the country seemed willing to look directly at something it had always kept in the dark. It did not last. The legal climate hardened, the cultural permission evaporated, and the industry retreated to the margins where it had always lived. But the people who came up in that first wave were unlike those who would come later. Many had real backgrounds in the arts: Broadway dancers, trained actors, writers, magazine editors. They were adults who had chosen an unusual road with their eyes open, and several of them would go on to become not just performers, but pioneers, founders, authors, activists, and, in one quietly extraordinary case, the architects of an entire support network for the women who came after them. There is a thread that ties many of the women in this section together, and it deserves to be named at the outset. In 1983, a group of them formed a private support group called Club 90, described as the first such group of its kind, a place where women in the industry could simply talk to one another as people. Its members included several of the figures profiled here. It is a small detail, but a telling one. Even in the 1970s and early 1980s, the people living these lives understood that they would need each other, and that the world outside was not going to make their second acts easy. This is where the modern story of life after the industry truly begins. Marilyn Chambers. She was for a time one of the most famous faces in America, and most of the people looking at that face had no idea who she was. Marilyn Chambers was born Marilyn Ann Briggs in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1952. Before she ever became a symbol of the porno chic moment, she had already achieved a peculiar kind of fame. Her wholesome, smiling image appeared on boxes of ivory snow laundry detergent, cradling a baby, the very picture of the all-American young mother. When she broke out as an adult performer in 1972, the collision of those two images, the soapbox innocent and the explicit film star, became a national talking point. The detergent company, the story goes, quietly pulled the boxes. The damage, or the publicity, was already done. Overnight, she was one of the most discussed women in the country. What is most interesting about Chambers, for the purposes of this book, is how restlessly and how deliberately she kept reaching for the mainstream. She was not content to be a single sensation. In 1977, she took the lead role in Rabid, a horror film directed by David Cronenberg, by then a rising and now a revered name in the genre. It was a genuine mainstream credit, and horror enthusiasts still discuss her performance in it without irony. She recorded a disco single. She built a touring act as an exotic dancer and singer that she reinvented again and again across the 1980s and beyond, keeping herself working as the culture that had briefly embraced her moved on. Her most unexpected turn came in 2004, when she ran for Vice President of the United States on the ticket of the Personal Choice Party, a small, libertarian-leaning protest campaign organized around the principle of personal freedom and the right to control one's own life and body. It was, in its way, a perfectly coherent capstone for a woman who had spent decades being told what she was allowed to be. She put her name on a ballot and made an argument about autonomy. Marilyn Chambers died in 2009 at the age of 56 at her home in Santa Clarita, California. The county coroner attributed her death to a brain hemorrhage related to a cerebral aneurysm, an underlying heart disease. She left behind a daughter. In obituaries that ran far outside the trade press, she was remembered as one of the defining figures of an era when the culture briefly let her kind of fame into the daylight. And as a woman who never once stopped trying to be more than the single thing she was known for, if this book has a patron saint of refusing to be reduced, it may be her. Linda Lovelace. No single film of the era was more famous than Deep Throat, and no performer's later life turned more sharply against her own beginnings than Linda Lovelace's. She was born Linda Susan Borman in 1949. The 1972 film made her, almost overnight, the single most recognizable name in adult entertainment, the human face of the entire porno chic phenomenon. The film was a cultural event far beyond its content. It was talked about by people who had never seen it and likely never would. For a young woman from an ordinary background, the sudden total nature of that fame was disorienting in ways the public could not have understood at the time. And then, over the years that followed, she became something almost no one could have predicted, one of the most prominent anti-pornography activists in the country. In 1980, she published a memoir, Ordeal, written with the journalist Mike McGrady. In it, and in the public testimony that followed, she described her time in the industry as a period of coercion and abuse at the hands of her then-husband, Chuck Traynor. She said she had been controlled, threatened, and forced. The book reframed the very film that had made her famous as, in her telling, a record of her own exploitation. She became a born-again Christian. She allied herself with the feminist anti-pornography movement, appearing on platforms alongside the writers Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, who saw in her account a powerful argument for their cause. In 1986, she testified before the Federal Commission on Pornography convened by the Attorney General, where her words became one of the movement's most frequently cited pieces of testimony. A woman the country had known only as a punchline or a fantasy now stood before a government commission and asked to be heard as a witness. It should be said plainly that her account has been both enormously influential and, in some quarters, contested in the decades since. Figures from the industry disputed parts of her story. Supporters insisted she was finally telling the truth about an experience the public had cheerfully refused to examine. This book does not pretend to adjudicate that argument. What is not in dispute is that Linda Borman spent the second half of her public life arguing against the very industry that had made her name, and that she did so with a conviction that reshaped a national conversation about consent, coercion, and the cost of that kind of fame. Her life was later dramatized in the 2013 biographical film Lovelace. She died in 2002, at 53, of injuries sustained in a car accident in Colorado. Whatever one finally makes of the debates that surrounded her, she remains one of the very few people in this book whose second act amounted to a repudiation of the first. And she is all the more singular and all the more human for the contradiction she carried to the end. Georgina Spelvin. If Linda Lovelace turned against her past, Georgina Spelvin simply walked calmly away from hers and went back to work. Born Shelley Graham in Houston, Texas in 1936, she was already a seasoned stage performer long before she ever appeared on film. She had danced and acted in Broadway productions, The Pajama Game, Cabaret, Guys and Dolls, Sweet Charity, building exactly the kind of working theater resume that thousands of performers spend their whole lives chasing. Her very stage name was a theatrical in-joke. George Spelvin is the traditional pseudonym American actors put in a program when, for one reason or another, they don't want their real name attached to a role. She feminized it, which tells you something about how she regarded the whole enterprise, with a professional's wry detachment. In 1973, she became the star of The Devil in Miss Jones, one of the defining films of the porno chic era, and in the judgment of many critics, one of the best acted of its kind. She was older than most of her peers and a trained actress, and it showed. The role made her a name during the brief window when such films were reviewed in real newspapers, and it remains the work she is most associated with. What she did next is, in its quietness, almost radical. She retired from adult films in 1982 at the age of 46 and got an ordinary job in the graphic arts business. No scandal, no crusade, no reinvention as a public personality. Just a capable woman going to work in a normal profession and living a private life for decades. In 2008, she revisited her own history on her own terms, self-publishing a memoir with the wry, perfectly characteristic title, The Devil Made Me Do It, which she sold through her personal website. Georgina Spelvin married John Welsh in 2000, and as of the most recent available reporting, she was living in long, contented retirement. A published author and one of the last living links to the very first wave of crossover adult fame. Of everyone in this book, she may have made both the least dramatic exit and the most graceful one. She treated her unusual career as a job she happened to do well, and then she did other things, and then she wrote it all down. There is a kind of dignity in that refusal to be either ashamed or self-mythologizing, a dignity worth pausing over. Gloria Leonard. Some performers became famous on screen. Gloria Leonard became important off it. Born Gail Sandra Klinetsky in the Bronx in 1940, she performed in the 1970s but found her real calling in the executive suite and on the barricades of the free speech movement. In 1977, she became the publisher of High Society magazine, not a model for it, the publisher of it, a role she would hold for roughly 14 years. In that job, she is credited with pioneering the magazine's pay-per-call telephone line, a small piece of media history that quietly anticipated an entire future industry of monetized phone and eventually online content. She saw a business model before almost anyone else did, but it was her work as an advocate that gave her lasting significance. Leonard served on the board of the Adult Video Association and then its successor organization, the Free Speech Coalition, becoming one of the industry's most articulate and respected public defenders during the censorship battles of the 1980s and 1990s. She was sharp, funny, and unintimidated in front of a microphone or a hostile interviewer, and she made the First Amendment case for her industry at a time when few were willing to make it in public. In 1983, she was also one of the founding members of Club 90, the women's support group whose thread runs through this whole section. There is a detail in her story that says more than any summary could. When Gloria Leonard died in 2014, at the age of 73, following a stroke while living in Hawaii, her personal papers were acquired by Harvard University, where they are preserved as a documented record of a life lived at the intersection of media, sexuality, and free expression. Think about what that means. A woman who began in one of the most disreputable corners of American culture ended as a primary source, a person that one of the world's great research universities decided history needed to keep. She left the screen and became, of all things, an archive. Few second acts are so quietly definitive. Annie Sprinkle. Annie Sprinkle's second act may be the most intellectually ambitious in this entire book, a journey from the margins of one industry to a Guggenheim Fellowship and a university press. Born Ellen Steinberg in 1954, she worked as a performer and sex worker from the early 1970s into the mid-1990s. Even within the industry, she was unusual, curious, theatrical, and increasingly interested in the ideas underneath the work rather than just the work itself. When she began to reinvent herself, she did it not as a celebrity, but as an artist and a scholar. In 2002, she earned a PhD from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco, becoming, by her own account, the first veteran of adult film to hold such a degree. She had turned her life into a subject of formal study, with herself as both researcher and evidence. Together with her partner, Beth Stevens, a professor of art at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Sprinkle went on to found an entire artistic and environmental movement they call ecosexuality, or sex ecology. The idea, in brief, is to reframe humanity's relationship with the natural world as one of intimacy and care, rather than ownership and extraction. To treat the earth, as the title of one of their books puts it, as a lover rather than a resource. It sounds whimsical until you encounter the seriousness with which they pursue it. Environmental art films, staged theatrical performances, academic symposia, gallery installations, and years of sustained collaboration. The recognition has been real, and from the establishment. In 2021, the pair were awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for their film Playing with Fire, and they co-authored the book Assuming the Ecosexual Position, The Earth as Lover, published by the University of Minnesota Press. These are not vanity credits. They are among the most competitive honors in American arts and letters. A founding member of Club 90 back in 1983, Annie Sprinkle has, in other words, spent the decades since building a body of work that universities teach and that major foundations fund. Well into her 70s, she remains an actively working artist and educator alongside Stevens. Her trajectory is a standing rebuke to the idea that the most exposed years of a life are necessarily the most serious ones. Pursued with enough rigor and enough nerve, reinvention can carry a person almost anywhere, even from the back rooms of the 1970s to the front of a university lecture hall. Veronica Vera. Veronica Vera came to the industry by an unusual road and left it by an even stranger one, to found an institution. Born in 1946 in Linden, New Jersey, she held an English degree and had worked on Wall Street before changing course entirely. That detail matters. She was an educated professional who chose a different life, not someone swept up by circumstance. In the 1980s, she became a sex journalist, performer, model, and an outspoken advocate for the rights of sex workers. She was photographed by the celebrated artist Robert Mapplethorpe, and her advocacy became part of the public record of the era's fierce debates over censorship and free expression. She testified, she wrote, she argued. She treated her experience as a basis for public engagement rather than something to hide. Her true second act began in 1992, when she founded Miss Vera's Finishing School for Boys Who Want to Be Girls in New York City, billed as the world's first cross-dressing and transgender academy, with Vera herself installed as its dean. The school offered instruction, community, and a kind of permission to people exploring their gender identity, decades before such exploration entered mainstream conversation. In 1997, she published a related book of the same name, and over the years she wrote hundreds of articles on human sexuality, building a reputation as a genuine educator in a field that, at the time, had very few public ones. It is worth sitting with how far ahead of her moment that was. In the early 1990s, the language and the cultural space for gender exploration that exist today were largely absent. Vera built a small, deliberate institution to meet a need that the wider world had barely begun to acknowledge, and she ran it with warmth and seriousness. A founding member of Club 90, she continues, as of recent reporting, to write and to operate the school she created. Hers is a life that moved from finance to journalism to film to founding a place that helped people become more fully themselves, an arc that no one watching her in the 1980s could possibly have predicted. If the through line of this section is that the women of the 1970s often became builders, Veronica Vera is the clearest case of all. She did not just leave the industry and find a new job. She left and built something that had never existed. Candida Royale. Candida Royale did not just leave the industry. She set out to remake it from the inside, and she largely succeeded. Born Candice Vidala in 1950, she performed through the 1970s and into the early 1980s before stepping behind the camera with a genuinely radical idea that adult films could be made from the perspective of female desire, for women and for couples, rather than for men alone. In an industry built almost entirely around one point of view, this was close to heresy. In 1984, she founded Femme Productions to put the idea into practice, and in doing so, she is widely credited as one of the founders of what came to be called feminist pornography, an entire approach to the genre that took the audience and the perspective she had been told did not exist, and built a body of work around them. Her influence reached far beyond film. In 1992, she co-founded the advocacy group Feminists for Free Expression, planting herself in the middle of the so-called feminist sex wars on the side of expression and choice. She designed a successful line of products and, This is the part that surprises people. She became a genuinely sought-after public intellectual on the subject of sexuality. She lectured at the American Psychiatric Association, at the Smithsonian, at the World Congress of Sexology, and at universities including Princeton, Columbia, Wellesley, and New York University, institutions that would never have acknowledged her earlier career invited her to speak as an authority. In 2004, she published a mainstream relationship advice book, How to Tell a Naked Man What to Do, aimed squarely at a general audience. A founding member of Club 90, Candida Royalle died in 2015 at the age of 64 of ovarian cancer. She was eulogized in the mainstream press, in outlets that take their obituaries seriously, as a pioneer and an innovator. The story they told was consistent. Here was a woman who took an industry that had used women as its subject and insisted, with real commercial and cultural success, that it could be authored by them instead. She changed the questions the genre was capable of asking. That is a rare thing for anyone to accomplish, and rarer still for someone the culture had filed away as disposable. Vanessa Del Rio. Vanessa Del Rio was the first major Latina star the American adult industry ever produced, and decades later, she has become something rarer still, a genuine cultural icon claimed by the art world and by hip-hop alike. Born Ana Maria Sanchez in Spanish Harlem in 1952, the daughter of a Cuban father and a Puerto Rican mother, she became one of the defining performers of the 1970s golden age before retiring from the screen in 1985. But it is her long afterlife as an icon that earns her place here. In 2008, the prestigious art book publisher Taschen released a lavish illustrated biography of her, titled 50 Years of Slightly Slutty Behavior. A limited art edition even included an original drawing by the underground comics legend R. Crumb, placing her, improbably, in the collections of serious art buyers. Trained as a young woman at New York's High School of Music and Art, Del Rio has worked as a painter and shown her art in galleries. She has been name-checked across decades of rap lyrics, embraced as a pioneer by Latino popular culture, and treated in her later years as an elder stateswoman of a world that rarely allows its veterans that dignity. A biographical feature film about her life has been in the works. Now in her 70s and an active public figure, Vanessa Del Rio occupies a singular position, a working-class girl from Spanish Harlem who became a barrier-breaking star, and then, improbably, a subject of art books and gallery walls. Her second act was not to leave her fame behind, but to be reclaimed by the culture on more dignified terms, as history, as influence, as art. Interlude: The Sisterhood of Club 90. Before we move from one decade to the next, it is worth pausing on a small, almost private piece of history that connects so many of the women in the previous chapters. And that says something essential about how people survive a life lived under stigma. In 1983, a handful of women who had performed in adult films began meeting together, informally, as friends. They were not a union, not a company, not a cause. They were simply a group of women who understood something about one another's lives that no one else in their world could. They called themselves Club 90, after the address where they first gathered, and they are generally remembered as the first support group of their kind, a place where women in one of the most isolating professions imaginable could sit in a living room and talk to one another as people rather than as products. The membership reads like a roll call of the most thoughtful figures from the porno chic generation. Annie Sprinkle was there. So were Veronica Vera, Gloria Leonard, Candida Royalle, and Veronica Hart, women who would go on in the decades that followed to become a performance artist with a doctorate, the founder of a school, a publisher whose papers Harvard would preserve, a pioneering feminist filmmaker, and a respected director. It is no accident that the women who built the most substantial second acts were also, many of them, the women who had found one another early and refused to face the world alone. Think about what such a group meant in its moment. These were women whose work the culture consumed eagerly and condemned loudly, often in the same breath. They could not talk honestly about their professional lives with most family members, most old friends, most of the ordinary institutions that hold a life together. The stigma did not just follow them into job interviews years later. It isolated them in the present, every day. Club 90 was a response to that isolation, a deliberate act of mutual recognition among people the world preferred not to look at directly. And it points to something this whole book keeps circling back to. Reinvention is almost never a solo achievement, however much the triumphant "Where are they now?" headline likes to frame it that way. Behind most of the second acts in these pages are other people, spouses, mentors, collaborators, and, in this remarkable case, a small circle of women who decided in 1983 that they would be witnesses to one another's actual lives. The decades of art, advocacy, scholarship, and reinvention that followed grew, in part, out of that living room. It is one of the quietly moving facts in the history of this industry, and it deserves to be remembered. Part 2, the 1980s, the video revolution. The 1980s changed everything, and the thing that changed it was a machine in the living room. The home video cassette recorder took adult film out of the theater and put it inside the house. There was no longer a ticket booth to walk past, no marquee to be seen under, no public act of attendance at all. The audience exploded, the volume of production exploded with it, and a new kind of star was born, less a creature of the big city art house scene, and more a face that millions of people came to know in total privacy. The performers who defined this decade became, in many cases, more famous than their 1970s predecessors, precisely because they were now welcome in places no theater could reach. And the smartest of them began to grasp something important, that their names had value, and that value could be carried into a life beyond performing. This is the decade that produced the clearest mainstream crossover in the whole book. It is also the decade that produced several of the book's most instructive complications. Performers whose later careers in radio, education, and directing ran alongside, rather than after, their work in the industry. The honest version of these stories is not a clean break. It is a set of parallel lives, lived at once, by people who were building their exits even as they kept working. To tell those lives truthfully, we have to give up the satisfying single arc and follow the real, branching one. Tracy Lords. Tracy Lords is the most complete reinvention in this book, and her story begins with one of its hardest truths. She was born Nora Louise Kuzma in Steubenville, Ohio, in 1968. As a teenager, she was drawn into the adult industry using a forged birth certificate. She was, in fact, a minor for nearly all of her brief time in it, a fact uncovered by federal investigators in 1986. There is no softening this, and she has not asked anyone to. She has spoken about those years as a survivor of exploitation, as a child who was used. The scandal that erupted when the truth came out sent shockwaves through the industry and could easily have ended her in the public eye, fixing her forever as the center of a sordid story she had not been old enough to consent to. Instead, she did something almost unheard of. She got out at 18, and she built a long, legitimate mainstream acting career. And she largely outran the story. Her breakthrough came in 1990, when the director John Waters cast her in Crybaby opposite Johnny Depp. It was a knowing, slightly subversive bit of casting, and she was good in it, and it opened a door. From there, she assembled a working actor's resume that most performers who never went near her past would envy. Consider the range of it. A role in Marvel's Blade in 1998, parts in films by Roger Corman and by Kevin Smith, a genuinely admired performance in the unsettling independent horror film Excision, and a long list of television credits across the most watched shows of the era. Married, with Children, Roseanne, Melrose Place, Will and Grace, plus recurring and regular roles on the series Profiler and First Wave. This was not a former scandal figure doing the occasional novelty cameo. This was a jobbing actress booking work year after year on her own ability. She also made music. The 1995 electronica album 1000 Fires produced the single Control, which appeared on the soundtrack to the film Mortal Kombat and found a real audience in clubs. Some promotional accounts of her music career have inflated its commercial success over the years. The durable, verifiable fact is simply that the work existed, that it was hers, and that people listened to it. In 2003, she published a memoir, Underneath It All, which debuted on the New York Times bestseller list and told the unvarnished story of her childhood, the abuse behind her teenage years, and her long climb into mainstream film. She controlled the narrative by writing it down. Traci Lords is still working. In 2020, she made her stage debut in a revival of the play Women Behind Bars, more than 30 years after a scandal that was supposed to define her permanently. She is, simply and durably, an actress, which was the whole point. Of all the second acts in this book, hers is the one that most completely escaped the gravity of the first. She was failed and exploited as a child, and she spent her adulthood proving she was more than the worst thing that had been done to her. That is not a comeback story. It is a survival story with a long, productive third act attached. Ginger Lynn. Ginger Lynn built two careers at once, and the story of how they tangled together is far more interesting than any clean exit could have been. Born Ginger Lynn Allen in Rockford, Illinois in 1962, she became one of the most popular performers of the early 1980s, known for a fresh, girl-next-door appeal and remembered as the first contracted star of the Vivid label, a status that made her, in effect, one of the first true brand-name performers of the video age. Industry retrospectives have ranked her among the most significant figures of her generation. When she stepped away from the industry in 1986, she moved into mainstream B-movies under her full name, Ginger Lynn Allen, working steadily in the kind of genre pictures that built durable cult followings. She turned up in Young Guns 2 in 1990, and later, memorably, in two films by the rock musician turned director Rob Zombie, The Devil's Rejects in 2005 and 31 in 2016, both of which gave her real, gritty character work. She did voice and on-camera video work for the Wing Commander game series, playing a recurring character, and she appeared in a Metallica music video. She was, in other words, a working genre actress with a recognizable name. Her life in those years was not without serious hardship, and she has been candid about it rather than hiding it. She was connected to the Traci Lords investigation. Asked to testify against producers, she refused. She has said she believes she was targeted afterward, and in 1991, she served roughly 4.5 months in federal prison for tax evasion, a fact confirmed in mainstream reporting at the time. She also had a widely covered relationship with the actor Charlie Sheen in the early 1990s, about which she has spoken frankly over the years, declining to trade in easy sensationalism. Honesty requires noting that Ginger Lynn did not, in the end, leave the industry for good. She returned to performing around 1999 and continued on and off for decades. She was inducted into an industry hall of fame as recently as 2024. Her real story, then, is not departure but parallel motion, a B-movie and music career built alongside a performing career she kept choosing to return to. That refusal to fit the tidy template is exactly why she belongs here. Now in her 60s and living relatively privately in California, she remains a familiar and unembarrassed presence at conventions and on podcasts, telling her own complicated story in her own voice, on her own terms. Christy Canyon. For Christy Canyon, the most successful second act was not on a screen at all. It was on the radio, where a quick wit and a warm, frank personality turned out to be worth more than any image ever had been. Born Melissa Bardesbanian in the Los Angeles area in 1966, she began performing on her 18th birthday and became one of the leading stars of the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, eventually appearing in well over 100 films across several distinct stints in the business. She was inducted into multiple industry halls of fame and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Free Speech Coalition in 2004. Within her field, in other words, she was about as established as a person could be. After retiring from performing in 1997, she reinvented herself as a broadcaster and discovered a real talent for it. She co-hosted the long-running call-in program Night Calls on Playboy Radio from 2005 to 2011, fielding questions from listeners with a candor and humor that translated naturally to audio. From there, she hosted a string of satellite radio programs, and beginning in December 2013, she anchored her own show on Vivid Radio. Behind the microphone, she built a durable second career that long outlasted her years on camera. Radio is unforgiving of people who are merely famous. It rewards people who are genuinely good company for an hour, and she was. In 2003, she also published a candid autobiography, Lights, Camera, Sex. As with several of her peers, the tidy narrative of a permanent exit does not quite hold. In later years, Canyon returned to producing adult content and even occasionally to performing, and she won a new industry award as recently as 2025. The point of telling her story is not to insist she walked away forever. She did not, but to recognize the reinvention that genuinely required new skill. Anyone can be photographed. Far fewer people can hold an audience with nothing but a voice and a personality, night after night, year after year. That broadcasting career is the achievement that defines her second act, and it is a real one. Proof that the most valuable thing a performer carries out of the industry may be the part of them that never depended on the camera at all. Secca. They called her the Platinum Princess, and one magazine went further still, dubbing her the Marilyn Monroe of her field. Secca was among the most recognizable adult superstars of the late 1970s and 1980s. And, in a detail that distinguishes her from almost everyone else in this book, she left the business on a matter of conscience. Born Dorothea Hundley in Radford, Virginia, in 1954, she came from a small southern town. She won a local beauty pageant, worked an ordinary job at a metals company, and arrived in the industry as an adult who had already lived an ordinary life, a fact that gave her a groundedness her fame never quite erased. At her peak, she was famous enough to cross over onto the major daytime talk shows of the era. She appeared on programs hosted by Oprah Winfrey, Phil Donahue, and Morton Downey Jr., and even turned up on Saturday Night Live, a spot she has credited to her then-boyfriend, the comedian Sam Kinison. Her cultural footprint was large enough that the director Paul Thomas Anderson has cited her as a primary inspiration for the central female character in his film Boogie Nights, the story of a fictional industry family in exactly her era. What makes her story resonate is why she stopped. Secca stepped away from performing in 1992, and she has said she did so because of the industry's inadequate response to the AIDS epidemic, its reluctance, at that frightening moment, to require testing or protection for the performers whose lives were on the line. It was a principled exit, taken at real cost to her own livelihood, and a quotable one. She was, in effect, willing to walk away from the work rather than keep doing it under conditions she believed were dangerous. She later told her own story in the 2013 autobiography Inside Secca, written with a collaborator, and she was the subject of the documentary Desperately Seeking Secca, and a participant in later films about life after the industry. Reliable recent reporting on her present-day life is scarce, and this book will not pretend otherwise or invent details to fill the gap. What can be responsibly said is that she relocated from Chicago to the Kansas City area in the mid-2000s and has lived a largely private life in the years since. She is a star of the analog age who, having made her stand on a matter she clearly considered one of life and death, seems to have chosen quiet over spotlight. After everything, that reads less like disappearance than like a person who decided she had said what she needed to say. Nina Hartley. Nina Hartley is in this book not because she left the industry. She never really did, but because she built alongside it one of the most substantial second identities any performer has ever managed, that of a credentialed health educator. She was born Marie Louise Hartman in Berkeley, California, in 1959, into a genuinely remarkable family. Her father was a radio announcer. Her mother was a biochemist. Her parents would later become Buddhists, and her grandfather had been a university physics professor and a noted labor and civil rights activist. This was a household of ideas and conviction, and she absorbed both. She has said she identified as a feminist while still a teenager, long before it became her public framework. And then there is the fact that surprises people who think they know her story. She graduated from San Francisco State University's nursing program, magna cum laude, in 1985, and became a licensed registered nurse. She began dancing and then performing, in part to finance those very studies. The familiar image of the performer who stumbles into the industry without options simply does not fit her. She entered it as an educated woman with a clinical credential and a fully formed political worldview, and she has spent her whole career insisting on being understood as exactly that. From that foundation, she constructed a career as a sex educator, built on a nurse's framework of health, anatomy, and consent. She created a long-running and widely known line of instructional videos. In 2006, she co-wrote, with her husband, a mainstream guide that earned respectful notices in the library trade press for its genuine emphasis on safety and accuracy. She has lectured at universities, including Dartmouth and Harvard, appeared repeatedly on national talk shows to discuss and defend her field with a clinician's composure, and served on the boards of advocacy organizations devoted to free expression and to the rights and safety of performers. She also turned up, in a small role, in Boogie Nights, fittingly, given how much of that film's world overlapped with her own. Hartley remains openly part of the industry, which is precisely why her story matters here. It complicates the comfortable assumption that dignity and reinvention require leaving, that the only respectable second act is an exit. She found a way to fold education, advocacy, and a real professional credential into a single, continuous life, and to do it in full public view, without apology, and without pretending to be something she is not. Hers is reinvention as deepening rather than escape, and it is no less a second act for that. Veronica Hart. Paul Thomas Anderson once called her the Meryl Streep of her field, and the compliment was specifically about acting, which is the key to understanding what Veronica Hart did with the rest of her career. Born Jane Hamilton, she earned a bachelor's degree in theater arts from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, in 1976, before becoming a leading and unusually well-reviewed performer of the late 1970s and early 1980s. She could actually act, and people noticed. The critic Frank Rich took note of her in the mainstream press, and she won multiple Best Actress honors within the industry for films like Amanda by Night. She was later given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Free Speech Coalition. In an era that did not demand much of its performers as actors, she brought genuine craft, and it set her apart. Her second act was to put that craft to work behind the camera. Operating under her real name, Jane Hamilton, she became a respected director, producer, and editor, and rose to an executive role at a major distribution company. She won industry awards for narrative features through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, including a musical parody that showed off a real sense of comedy and structure. When the company she worked for was sold and the business shifted away from the kind of story-driven features she cared about, she moved on rather than compromise the things she was good at. She also kept one foot in the mainstream as an actor. She appears as a judge in Boogie Nights, a film whose wrenching custody battle subplot was reportedly drawn in part from her own life, which gives her presence in it a quiet poignancy. She turned up in an episode of the acclaimed HBO drama 6 Feet Under, and she did off-Broadway theater work, returning to the stage training where she had started. Over the years, she also worked as a guide at a museum devoted to the cultural history of her industry, and reporting indicates she later did sex education work abroad. As with Secca, dependable reporting on her most recent years is limited, and this book declines to invent detail to fill that silence. What is clear is the shape of the career. A gifted, stage-trained actress who, when her performing years wound down, simply walked to the other side of the camera and kept making things. She was a craftsperson before the industry, during it, and after it. The medium changed, and the job title changed, but the underlying identity never did. Of everyone in this section, she may be the purest example of a working artist who treated every chapter as another opportunity to do the work well. Jeannie Pepper. Jeannie Pepper belongs in any honest history of this industry because she helped integrate it. Born in 1958, she entered the business in 1982, at a time when Black women were largely relegated to its margins, and became one of the first African American performers to achieve real prominence. In 1997, she became the first African American woman inducted into the AVN Hall of Fame, a clean, documented first that marks her as a genuine trailblazer. She came up alongside a small cohort of Black women who together forced open a door that had been effectively closed. Her later life is less a dramatic career reinvention than a long, quiet stewardship of that legacy. She stepped back from on-camera work and has maintained a modest public presence built around her history as a pioneer. Reliable recent reporting on her day-to-day life is thin, and this book will not invent it. What is well established is her place in the record as a woman who expanded, who got to be a star. That, in its way, is its own kind of second act. The role of the elder who broke a barrier and lived to see it acknowledged. Not every meaningful life after fame is a new career. Sometimes it is simply the dignity of being recognized, at last, as the pioneer you were. Angel Kelly. Angel Kelly made history with a signature. Born in Lansing, Michigan, in 1962, she was active from the mid-1980s into the early 1990s, and in 1987 she became the first African-American woman to sign an exclusive studio contract, a milestone in an industry that had long treated Black performers as interchangeable and disposable. It was a small piece of paper with real significance. A Black woman, for the first time, given the kind of branded, exclusive deal that signaled genuine star status. She was later inducted into the AVN Hall of Fame, and then she did something many of her peers did not. She left cleanly in 1991 and built an entirely separate life. By the 2000s, she was living in Memphis, Tennessee, working in the music business as a manager and promoter, a full second career in another corner of the entertainment world. She has given occasional retrospective interviews reflecting on what it meant to be a Black pioneer in the business, speaking with candor about both the breakthroughs and the limits of her era. The most recent firm reporting on her places her in that Memphis music life, and this book describes her present in general terms rather than inventing specifics. What stands clearly on the record is the shape of it, a woman who broke a barrier, then walked away from the spotlight entirely and made a new working life on her own terms, far from where she started. Interlude: The Shadow of the Epidemic. It is impossible to write honestly about the performers of the 1980s without acknowledging the catastrophe that ran underneath the entire decade, the AIDS epidemic. For the adult film industry, the epidemic was not an abstraction or a distant tragedy. It was an occupational reality that arrived with terrifying speed and forced everyone in the business to make decisions about risk that most professions never have to contemplate. The science was new and frightening, the public response was slow and cruel, and the industry's own reckoning with how to protect its performers was, by many accounts, halting and incomplete. People in this world watched colleagues fall ill. They made choices under fear and uncertainty about whether and how to keep working. We have already met one performer whose second act was shaped directly by that reckoning. Seka, the Platinum Princess, one of the biggest stars of the era, has said she stepped away from performing in 1992 specifically because of the industry's inadequate response to the epidemic, its reluctance at the time to require the testing and protection that performers' lives depended on. Hers was a conscience-driven exit, taken at real cost, and it stands as one of the most principled departures in this book. She was, in effect, unwilling to keep working under conditions she had judged to be a matter of life and death. That decision casts a particular light on the careers of everyone who worked in those years. The performers of the 1980s were not simply chasing fame or money in a vacuum. They were doing a kind of work that, in that decade, carried a shadow most of their audience never thought about. And the choices they made about when to stay and when to leave were, for some of them, choices about survival. It is one more reason to resist the easy, sensational version of these lives. Behind the glamorous publicity images of the video boom were real people navigating a genuine public health crisis, often with far less protection and far less honest information than they deserved. It also reframes what reinvention meant for this generation. For some, leaving the industry was not only about stigma or ambition or the natural end of a career. It was, at least in part, about getting out of harm's way, and about insisting, as Seika did, that performers were human beings whose safety mattered more than the next production. That insistence, quiet as it was, helped push the industry toward the testing protocols and protections that came later. The second acts in the next chapters were built, in some cases, by people who had simply decided they wanted to live to have one. Part 3. The 1990s, Superstars and Entrepreneurs. By the 1990s, the business had learned to manufacture stars on an industrial scale, and then the internet arrived and rewrote the rules all over again. The performers who defined this decade were brands as much as they were people, and the savviest of them understood this earlier and more clearly than anyone in the industry's history. They grasped that a name had equity, that a likeness could be licensed, that a career was an asset to be structured rather than a wave to be ridden until it broke on the rocks. The result is a generation of post-industry lives defined, more than any before them, by entrepreneurship and deliberate reinvention. One built a company that a mainstream media empire paid millions of dollars to acquire. One founded and ran her own studio. One walked away at the height of her fame to sell real estate, trading the most exposed job imaginable for one of the most ordinary. And one, in the single, most improbable second act in this entire book, went back to school in her 40s and became a licensed attorney in her 50s. These are the stories of the people who took the most modern version of this fame and turned it into something they could actually carry with them into the rest of their lives. It is also, fair warning, the section with the widest spread between the documented and the private. The biggest names left long paper trails, memoirs, business filings, news coverage that followed them for decades. Others stepped away so completely that the honest reporter eventually runs out of verifiable road. Where that happens, this book stops, says so, and refuses to manufacture a present-day life on someone's behalf. The dignity of these stories depends on that restraint as much as on the telling. Asia Carrera. If this book has a single emblem of reinvention, it is Asia Carrera, a 1990s superstar who became, decades later, and against very long odds, a licensed attorney. She was born Jessica Steinhauser in New York City in 1973, of German and Japanese parentage, and raised in New Jersey. She was, from the start, a gifted student. She won a full scholarship to Rutgers University before her life took a sharp and different turn. As a performer in the 1990s, she became one of the best-known stars of her generation, the first Asian performer to be named her industry's Female Performer of the Year, later inducted into multiple halls of fame, and the holder of a verified Mensa membership that made her press-ready reputation as the brilliant one entirely earned rather than invented. She taught herself web design at a time when that was still a rare and valuable skill, ran her own website by hand, created custom content for a popular video game, and even reviewed software for a computing magazine. The intelligence was not a marketing gimmick. It was real, and it would matter enormously later. Then came the part of her life that reads like a novel, and not a gentle one. She retired in 2003, married, and moved to St. George, Utah, about as far from her former world as a person could get. In 2006, her husband was killed in a car accident while she was pregnant, and she found herself raising two very young children largely on her own, in an unfamiliar place, in grief. She lived quietly and, for a stretch, reclusively. proud and outspoken atheist, she briefly made national news in 2014 for wearing a colander on her head in her Utah driver's license photo, a gentle protest about religious exemptions. She has also spoken openly, and without self-pity, about living with autism, attention deficit disorder, and anxiety. And then she went back to school and kept going for years. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology, then a master's degree in education, then in 2024, a law degree. Along the way, she became, by some accounts, a college classmate of her own child. In April 2026, in her early 50s, she passed the Texas bar examination, clearing the final hurdle to becoming an attorney. Sit with the full shape of that arc for a moment. A 1990s headliner had become a widowed single mother of two in a small Utah town, who then methodically earned 3 advanced degrees and qualified to practice law. There is no tidier, more complete rebuttal to the idea that the most exposed years of a life must be the most important ones. Asia Carrera spent her 50s proving that the story was nowhere near over. Jenna Jameson was the first true crossover celebrity her industry ever produced, and the first to prove, decisively, that the name itself could be the business. Born Jenna Marie Masoli in Las Vegas in 1974, she became the defining adult star of the 1990s and into the 2000s, famous in a way that reached far past the trade and into the general culture. People who could not have named a single other performer knew hers. But what truly set her apart was not the fame. It was what she did with it. In 2000, she co-founded Club Jenna, an early and unusually sophisticated internet company built entirely around her own brand. While much of the industry still thought in terms of individual films and individual paychecks, she was building a company, a recurring, scalable business, with her name as the central asset. It worked spectacularly. Club Jenna grew into a substantial enterprise, and in 2006, the mainstream media company Playboy Enterprises acquired it in a widely reported deal valued in the tens of millions of dollars. Read that again. A mainstream, publicly traded media company paid millions to buy the business she had built around herself. She had turned her own name into a company worth acquiring. A feat of self-branding that anticipated by more than a decade the entire economy of personal brands and creator businesses that would later become ordinary. She was also, improbably to anyone who underestimated her, a serious author. Her 2004 memoir, How to Make Love Like a Porn Star, written with the journalist Neil Strauss, and pointedly subtitled A Cautionary Tale, spent weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It is, beneath the provocative title, a candid and often painful account of a difficult early life, abuse, loss, addiction, and survival, told with more honesty than the genre usually allows. Figures for her personal wealth circulate widely online and are essentially worthless as fact. The solid, verifiable achievements are the company she built, the major media sale, and the genuine bestseller with her name on the spine. Her later years have been turbulent and lived, for better and worse, largely in public. A series of reinvention narratives around sobriety, weight, motherhood, and faith, and a number of widely covered personal and health episodes. In early 2022, she was hospitalized and initially told she had Guillain-Barré syndrome, with grim prognoses reported at the time. That diagnosis was later walked back as a misdiagnosis, though she has continued to speak about ongoing health struggles. Out of fairness, this book states the sequence rather than the headline. As of recent reporting, she remains an active media and social media personality, still narrating her own ups and downs to an audience that has followed her for the better part of 3 decades. Whatever the next chapter holds, her place in this story is permanent. She was the one who figured out, before anyone else, that the brand could outlast the career, and then proved it with a sale that made the mainstream pay attention. Houston. Houston's public fame rested largely on a single record-setting publicity event in 1999, the kind of stunt the press loved to report and rarely bothered to look past. What is more worth knowing is what she tried to do afterward, and how honestly she has talked about how hard it was. Born Kimberly Halsey in 1969, she left the industry around 2002 and set out to build an ordinary professional life. She attended real estate school and became a licensed agent in Nevada, a deliberate, sensible move toward stability and respectability. But she has spoken candidly about the stigma she encountered along the way a past in adult film can follow a person into a job interview, a workplace, a community, and quietly close doors that would have stayed open for anyone else. Her experience is a useful corrective to the fantasy of the frictionless second act. Reinvention is not just a matter of deciding to change, it is a matter of getting the world to let you. She was a featured subject in the 2012 documentary After Porn Ends, a film built specifically around former performers and the lives they made, or struggled to make, after leaving the business. In it, she reflected on reinvention, on being recognized, and on the long tail of a notoriety she had not necessarily wanted to keep. That documentary is the clearest, most reliable window we have into her own thinking, and it is where her story is best anchored. Honesty obliges a caveat here, and this book will honor it. Dependable reporting on Houston thins out considerably after that documentary, and there is no responsible way to narrate a present-day life she has not publicly described. Her story is therefore smaller in these pages than some of the others, not because it matters less, but because she is owed the same restraint as everyone here. What it offers, in its candor about stigma and the friction of starting over, may actually make it one of the most representative stories in the book. The experience not of the superstar, with a memoir and a company, but of the ordinary person trying to convert an extraordinary, unwanted notoriety into a normal life, and saying out loud how difficult that conversion really is. Jill Kelly. Jill Kelly's story carries the deepest grief in this book, and alongside that grief, a striking example of a performer who became a boss. Born Adrienne Moore in Pomona, California, in 1971, she took her stage name from 2 of the actresses on the television series Charlie's Angels and became a prominent performer in the 1990s and early 2000s. What distinguished her professionally was the move into ownership. In 1998, she founded her own production and distribution company, Jill Kelly Productions, a genuinely uncommon achievement for a woman in that era of the industry, when the people who own the companies and the people who appeared in the films were almost never the same person. She built a real catalog and a real business. The company later ran into financial trouble, and in 2005 its assets were acquired by Penthouse in a deal reported at well over $1 million. But the underlying fact stands. She had been an owner, not just talent. Behind the business was a private tragedy she has spoken about openly, and it must be handled with care because it deserves nothing less. Her husband, the performer known as Cal Jammer, died by suicide in 1995, outside her home. It is difficult to overstate how devastating such a loss is, or how long its shadow stretches. She has discussed it publicly, including in a documentary, not for sensation, but as part of telling the truth about her life, and it sits at the emotional center of any honest account of who she is. To write about Jill Kelly without it would be to leave out the thing that shaped everything that followed. Kelly retired from the industry around 2005 and has kept a deliberately low profile in the years since. This book respects that choice completely and does not speculate about the texture of her current daily life. What the public record clearly shows is a woman who endured an almost unimaginable loss, who built and ran a company of her own in an industry that rarely handed women that role, and who then chose privacy and quiet. That is a perfectly honorable third act. It simply happens not to be a public one. And a person who has given the public as much as she has is more than entitled to keep the rest for herself. Tara Patrick. Tara Patrick approached her own fame the way a shrewd business person approaches a valuable asset, as something to own, structure, and license, rather than simply to spend and watch disappear. Born Linda Ann Hopkins in Great Falls, Montana in 1976, she began as a fashion model, signed to a major modeling agency, before entering adult film and becoming one of the most recognizable stars of the late 1990s and 2000s. That modeling background mattered. She came in already understanding image as a commodity and herself as a property to be managed, and she carried that mindset through her whole career. Rather than work solely as a contracted performer collecting a fee, she founded her own production company and emphasized, in interview after interview, that she owned her catalog and earned ongoing royalties by licensing it internationally. She wanted the back end, not just the paycheck, a strategy that anticipated by years how a later generation of online creators would learn to think about owning their own work. In 2010, she published a memoir, Sinner Takes All, a memoir of love and porn, written with the journalist Carrie Borzillo. It traced her path from a Montana childhood through her career and her marriage with the kind of frankness that turns a famous name back into a person. Away from the business, she diversified into licensing ventures and pursued martial arts with real seriousness, earning a black belt and competing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a discipline that rewards exactly the patience and self-possession her business strategy reflected. As of recent reporting, she remains an active businesswoman, managing and licensing her own brand, with a public profile built around entrepreneurship, her writing, and her athletic pursuits rather than around performing. Hers is one of the cleaner reinventions in the book, and one of the most modern, a model who became a star who became an owner, and an owner who made sure she kept the rights. In an industry that has historically been very good at using people up and discarding them, she insisted on being the one who controlled and continued to profit from her own name. That is its own kind of quiet victory. Raylene. Raylene's second act is the most ordinary one in this book, and that very ordinariness is exactly what makes it worth telling. Born Stacy Bernstein in Glendora, California in 1977, she began performing in the late 1990s. Then, in 2001, she did something quietly remarkable for a working performer at the time. She retired specifically in order to pursue a conventional career, becoming a licensed real estate agent in the Los Angeles area. She traded one of the most exposed jobs imaginable for one of the most thoroughly mainstream. Showings and listings, clients and contracts, the unglamorous daily business of helping people buy and sell homes. There was no grand reinvention narrative attached, no memoir, no crusade. There was just a decision to go do something normal, and the follow-through to actually do it. Her path was not a single clean line. She returned to performing for a stretch around 2009, before stepping away again. And the detailed public reporting on her life is thinner than for the bigger names in these pages. This book notes that rather than embroidering past it, what is documented and what matters is the real estate pivot, a deliberate, practical move toward the everyday world of work that most people inhabit. She has been married and is a mother, and by available accounts has lived much of her life out of the public eye, which is its own quiet statement of priorities. There is no Guggenheim Fellowship here, no bar examination passed in middle age, no company sold to a media empire for millions. There is just a person who decided she wanted a normal job and a normal life and went and built them. For someone carrying her particular history, for someone who would have had to explain that history to every broker, every colleague, every client who recognized her. That is its own real accomplishment, and a fitting human-scaled place to close the gallery of lives this book set out to follow. Not every second act has to be spectacular to be a triumph. Sometimes the triumph is simply the ordinary life, claimed on purpose against the odds. Heather Hunter. Heather Hunter may be the clearest example in this book of a performer who became, in full earnest, an artist. Born in the Bronx in 1969, she was one of the most recognizable Black women in the industry in the 1990s. But art came first and lasted longest. A teenage graffiti writer who studied at New York's High School of Fashion Industries, she returned to visual art with real seriousness after her performing years, painting under her own name and, in 2006, opening her own gallery in Brooklyn to show her work. She also built a music career that drew genuine industry talent. Her 2005 hip-hop album featured production from figures as respected as DJ Premier and Scott Storch, and she recorded alongside a range of established rap artists. Years earlier, she had crossed into mainstream hip-hop visibility through an appearance in a Tupac Shakur music video, and she has been referenced throughout rap culture. She published a novel in 2007 and has worked as a photographer, painter, gallery owner, recording artist, author, photographer. Heather Hunter's later life reads like a deliberate, sustained campaign to be taken seriously as a creator. She is living and active in the arts, and her trajectory stands as one of the book's strongest rebuttals to the idea that a performer's story ends when the performing does. For her, it was closer to a beginning. Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels came to the industry from one of the most respectable professions imaginable and built a long second career behind the camera. Born in Brooklyn in 1958, he worked as a nurse for roughly 6 years before entering the business in 1988, one of the era's pioneering Black male performers. A note for the record, he is not the Canadian novelist of the same name who won a major literary prize. The two are frequently and wrongly conflated online. What distinguishes his story is the pivot to directing. Beginning in 1991, he moved behind the camera, building a substantial career as a director and producer, and he was recognized by the trade as one of the most significant male performers of his generation, as well as a figure in the industry's early efforts to organize and advocate for its workers. His reinvention, like Nina Hartley's, ran largely within the industry rather than away from it, from performer to filmmaker and businessman. But it is a reinvention all the same, and a notably durable one. He converted a performing career into a creative and entrepreneurial one, and sustained it for decades, at a time when very few Black men in the business were given the chance to direct at all. He remains, by available accounts, a working director. His arc is a reminder that a second act does not always mean leaving the field. Sometimes it means climbing within it, from the most exposed job to one with far more control. Interlude. From talent to owner. If the women of the 1970s tended to become builders and the performers of the 1980s tended to become broadcasters and directors, the defining instinct of the generation that followed was something subtly different and distinctly modern: the drive to own. For most of the industry's history, there was a sharp and rarely crossed line between the people who appeared in the films and the people who owned them. The performers were talent, paid a fee, used for a production, and all too often discarded when their moment passed. The value they created accrued to someone else: the studio, the distributor, the catalog owner. It was a structure almost perfectly designed to use people up. The smartest performers of the 1990s and 2000s set out to break that structure. And the pattern recurs across this book like a refrain. Jenna Jameson co-founded a company built around her own name and sold it to a mainstream media corporation for millions. Jill Kelly founded her own production house in an era when almost no woman did. Tara Patrick made a point of owning her catalog and collecting royalties on it for years afterward, talking about licensing and rights the way a small business owner talks about inventory. Jenna Hayes built a studio of her own before retiring on her own terms. Even the broadcasting careers of figures like Christy Canyon were, in their way, a claim of ownership over a voice, a personality, a platform that no producer could repossess. This was more than a business strategy. It was a form of self-protection, and in some ways, a form of dignity. To own your work is to refuse to be merely consumed by it. It is to convert a career that the world treats as disposable into an asset you can carry forward, license, sell, or walk away from on your own schedule. The performers who understood this early were, not coincidentally, often the ones who emerged from the industry with the most intact sense of authorship over their own stories. It is striking how completely this instinct anticipated the wider economy that was coming, years before the rise of the modern creator economy, before millions of people would build personal brands and monetize them directly, before owning your audience became conventional business wisdom. Performers in this stigmatized corner of the culture were already living it out of necessity. They had learned the hard way that fame without ownership is a trap. The lesson they worked out for themselves turned out to be one the whole world would eventually need to learn. Part 4, the 2000s, a new kind of crossover. By the 2000s, the cultural ground had shifted again. The internet was everywhere. Celebrity itself was becoming more porous and more participatory, and the wall between the adult industry and the mainstream, never as solid as it pretended to be, grew thinner still. Reality television had taught audiences to follow real people through messy public lives. Tabloid culture was insatiable, and into that environment came a generation of performers who were, more than ever, treated as personalities first and performers second. What is striking about the figures in this section is how differently their crossovers went. One became a legitimate mainstream actress and published novelist whose later career has almost nothing to do with where she started. One turned a brief, headline-grabbing career into a genuine, if unusual, footnote in American political history. And one became one of the most quoted voices warning others away from the path she had taken, a reminder that not every second act is a triumph, and that the honest ones include the cautionary tales. Together they map the widening range of what life after the industry could look like, once the internet had blurred all the old lines. Sasha Grey. Sasha Grey may be the most thorough mainstream crossover of anyone in this book, whose career began in the 21st century. And the breadth of her later work is genuinely hard to summarize, because she has refused to be only one thing. She was born Marina Ann Hansis in North Highlands, California, in 1988. She became one of the most discussed adult performers of the mid to late 2000s, and then, in 2009, at the age of 21, she left the industry. What makes her notable here is not that she left, but where she went, and how many directions she went at once. The acting was real and well regarded. In 2009, the Academy Award-winning director Steven Soderbergh cast her in the lead of his independent film, The Girlfriend Experience. Not a cameo trading on her notoriety, but a demanding leading role in an art film by a major director. 2 years later, she appeared in a recurring arc on HBO's hit series, Entourage, playing a fictionalized version of herself. Then she became a novelist. Her debut, The Juliet Society, was published in 2013 and translated for readers in roughly 24 countries, and she followed it with sequels. She has worked in experimental music, recording and performing as part of a project with a creative partner, and has continued as a DJ. And then, in a turn that surprised even people who had followed her other reinventions, she became a major presence in gaming. She began streaming on the platform Twitch in 2019 and built an audience of well over 1 million followers, broadcasting gameplay and cooking segments to a community that, in many cases, had no particular interest in her earlier career at all. In 2023, she joined the voice cast of the acclaimed video game Cyberpunk 2077 in its expansion, playing an in-game radio DJ. As of recent reporting, she remains an active author, musician, and digital creator. She is, almost by definition, the modern template for the post-industry reinvention. A person who treated her exit not as the end of a story, but as permission to start several new ones at once, and who has succeeded, on the merits, in fields that have nothing to do with where the public first met her. When journalists look for a single example of how completely a performer can remake a public life in the internet age, they tend to land on her, and with good reason. Mary Carey. Mary Carey's place in this book is secured not by a film or a company, but by a ballot. Performing under that stage name, she became a tabloid and novelty figure in the early to mid-2000s. But what she is genuinely remembered for, the thing that turns up in history books rather than trade magazines, is her candidacy in the extraordinary 2003 California gubernatorial recall election, the chaotic contest that ultimately sent Arnold Schwarzenegger to the governor's office. The ballot in that race ballooned to 135 candidates, a carnival of hopefuls and publicity seekers, and Mary Carey ran as an independent among them. She finished 10th with more than 11,000 votes, a modest number that nonetheless placed her ahead of more than 100 other candidates and earned her a permanent, if peculiar, line in the record of that strange election. The run was, by any honest account, partly a publicity effort tied to the company she was associated with at the time, but it also placed her briefly inside the actual machinery of American democracy, debating issues, fielding press questions, appearing on ballots that real voters marked. She flirted with the idea of running again during a later California recall, but did not ultimately file. Her later life is more modestly documented than that of the bigger names in this book, and it would be dishonest to inflate it into a grand professional reinvention. By recent accounts, she has left the industry and divides her time between Florida and California. Her second act, in truth, is best understood as a single vivid moment rather than a long arc, an unlikely brush with politics that turned a performer, for one strange election season, into a genuine footnote in the history of her state. Not every story in this book is an empire or a law degree. Some are just one improbable, oddly democratic chapter, and there is something quietly American about that one. Bree Olson. Bree Olson's story is one of the hardest in this book, and one of the most important to include, because it is the clearest cautionary tale among them, told, courageously, by the person who lived it. Born Rachel Marie Oberlin in 1986, she was an active performer from roughly 2006 to 2011. She also drew a wave of mainstream tabloid attention in 2011 as one of the live-in partners during the actor Charlie Sheen's very public personal crisis. A chaotic, painful episode that put her in front of a far larger audience than her film work ever had, and not on terms of her own choosing. What distinguishes her second act is its honesty. In a series of widely covered interviews around 2016, with major news outlets and in a documentary-style video series, she spoke with unusual candor about the lasting stigma of having been in the industry. She described how difficult it became to find ordinary work, to form friendships, to be accepted back into mainstream life by people who knew her history. She talked about aspiring to a career in healthcare and fearing that recognition could quietly close that door. And she said, plainly and repeatedly, that she would advise young women against entering the industry, not as a judgment of others, but as a warning drawn from her own hard experience. Some details of her account, including figures about what she once earned, are her own statements rather than independently verified facts, and this book presents them as such. What is not in doubt is the emotional truth she has been willing to share, that leaving the industry was, for her, not a clean door into a new life, but the beginning of a long and painful struggle for reintegration and acceptance. She has positioned herself, in the years since, around mental health awareness and the destigmatization of former sex workers. Her story complicates the optimism that runs through much of this book, and it should. For every reinvention that lands as a triumph, there are people for whom the stigma proved heavier and the road back harder than any outsider could see. Bree Olson's contribution is to say that out loud, on the record, when it would have been far easier to stay silent. That candor is its own kind of second act, a decision to make her difficult experience useful to someone else. It deserves to be honored as such. Lexington Steele. Lexington Steele walked into the adult industry from a Wall Street trading floor, and he ran his career like the businessman he had trained to be. Born Clifton Britt in Morristown, New Jersey, in 1969, he attended Morehouse College before transferring to Syracuse University, where he earned a degree in history and African American Studies in 1993. He became a licensed stockbroker, working in finance, including at an office in the World Trade Center, before entering the industry. That business school sensibility defined everything that followed. As a performer, he became one of the most decorated male stars of the 2000s, the first to be named the trade's Male Performer of the Year 3 times, and a Hall of Fame inductee. But his lasting significance is as an owner. He founded and runs his own production companies, building himself into one of the industry's most prominent Black entrepreneurs, and joining the small group of performers like Jill Kelly and Tara Patrick, who understood that real power lay in owning the work rather than merely appearing in it. He took the discipline of a financial professional and applied it to a business that had rarely rewarded that kind of thinking. He remains an active businessman and director. His story is a particular kind of second act. less an exit than an ascent, from talent to chairman, carried by an education and a financial world rigor the industry had almost never seen before. Katsuni. Katsuni was one of the few performers of her era to be a true international star, equally known in Europe and the United States, and she has spent her later life as a writer, actress, and martial artist under her own name. Born Céline Tran in Paris in 1979, to a Vietnamese father and a French mother, she studied for a year at a French political science institute before entering the industry, where she became a leading European and Asian crossover star of the 2000s, winning dozens of international awards and a Hall of Fame induction. Then, after retiring around 2013, she reinvented herself with evident intention. Working under her real name, she has built a career as an author, screenwriter, and mainstream actress, with credits in a popular French web series and a Cambodian action film, alongside voice work and public speaking on personal development. A serious martial artist, she has folded that discipline into her public identity as well. Some of the finer details of her later work rest on her own account, and this book presents them accordingly. But the broad shape is well established and reported in the French press. A global star who came home, took back her own name, and built a varied, creative life around writing and performance. She remains active in France as a writer and media figure, proof that the crossover she achieved at her peak between continents and audiences was matched by an equally deliberate crossover out of the industry afterward. Eva Angelina. Eva Angelina's story complicates the neat, left-it-all-behind narrative, which is exactly why it belongs here, honestly told. Born in Huntington Beach, California, in 1985, of Cuban, Chinese, English, and Irish descent, she became one of the most popular performers of the late 2000s. Around 2017, she stepped away and built a mainstream second career, working as a licensed real estate agent with a Los Angeles brokerage, the same practical, respectable pivot chosen by several other performers in this book. But honesty requires the rest of the story. By reporting around 2024, she had returned to the industry rather than remaining in real estate. Hers is therefore not a clean one-way exit, but a back and forth, the kind of non-linear path that real lives so often follow and that the tidy reinvention story tends to erase. The detailed public record on her is thinner than for the biggest names, and this book flags that rather than papering over it. What her story offers is a useful corrective. Not every second act sticks. Not every departure is permanent. People leave, try something else, and sometimes return. And that too is a true and human shape for a life to take. She is included here not as a finished arc, but as an honest one. Interlude. Telling your own story. Look back across the chapters so far and notice how often a single object recurs. A book. Not a film, not a company. A book, written by the performer, telling the story in her own words. Linda Borman wrote Ordeal. Georgina Spelvin wrote The Devil Made Me Do It. Tracy Lords wrote Underneath It All, and it landed on the New York Times bestseller list. Christy Canyon wrote Lights, Camera, Sex. Seca wrote Inside Seca. Candida Royale wrote a mainstream advice book. Veronica Vera wrote about her school. Nina Hartley co-wrote a guide that the library press praised. Jenna Jameson's memoir was a genuine bestseller, and Tara Patrick's told her story from Montana onward. Stoya built an entire second career out of the written word in the country's most respected publications. Again and again, the people in this book reached for the same tool. There is a reason for that, and it goes to the heart of everything these stories are about. For most of their public lives, these performers did not get to narrate themselves. Other people did it for them: directors, marketers, tabloid writers, late-night punchlines, and an audience that had already decided what they were. The single most consistent feature of the stigma they carried was the loss of authorship over their own identities. The world told their story, loudly and on its own terms, and they were not invited to respond. To write a memoir under those conditions is an act of reclamation. It is a way of saying, "You have heard the version of me that other people sold. Now here is mine." It is no accident that so many of the most complete second acts in this book belong to people who, at some point, sat down and wrote the story themselves. The book was not just a product or a payday. It was a way of taking back the pen. The internet, for all its cruelties, accelerated this. By the time we reached the most recent figures in these pages, the memoir had been joined by the column, the podcast, the post, the direct address to millions of followers with no middleman at all. The performers of the 2010s could answer the "where are they now" question themselves in real time before anyone else got to answer it for them. That is a genuinely new development in the long history of fame, and these subjects were among the first to seize it. Whatever else has changed, the underlying human impulse is the same one that drove a woman in 1980 to write Ordeal: the determination to be the author of your own life, and not merely a character in someone else's telling of it. Part 5, the 2010s and beyond, the Internet era. By the 2010s, the ground had not just shifted, it had become something genuinely new. Social media collapsed the distance between performers and the public entirely. A person could become globally famous in days, build a direct relationship with millions of followers, and, crucially, speak for themselves without a studio or a publicist or a magazine standing in between. For the first time, the people in these stories could narrate their own lives in real time, to audiences larger than any film had ever reached. That changed what a second act could be. The figures in this final section are defined less by a clean break from the industry than by the way they use the new tools to redefine themselves on their own terms. As writers published in the most prestigious outlets in the country, as media personalities and commentators, as entrepreneurs, and as advocates willing to argue publicly, and sometimes combatively, about the industry they had passed through. Their stories are still being written, which is part of the point. In the Internet era, the "where are they now" question is one the subjects increasingly get to answer themselves. Mia Khalifa. Few people in this entire book had a shorter time in the industry than Mia Khalifa, and almost none became more globally known for it, a paradox that has defined her public life and that she has spent years trying to reframe on her own terms. She was born in Beirut, Lebanon, in 1993, and her family moved to the United States when she was a child. She was raised in a conservative religious household. Her stint in the adult industry began in 2014 and was, by her account, extremely brief. She became internationally infamous almost overnight, in large part because of a single religiously themed scene that ignited furious controversy across the Middle East and brought her serious threats. The speed and scale of that notoriety were unlike almost anything in the industry's history, and it attached itself to her permanently. An important and sensitive dispute sits at the center of her story, and honesty requires presenting both sides. Khalifa has said her actual on-set work lasted only about 3 months, and that she earned roughly $12,000 in total, a figure she uses to argue that she was a very young woman who made a brief decision that has followed her for life. The studio she worked with has publicly disputed those numbers, stating that she earned far more and was associated with the industry longer. This book does not pretend to resolve that disagreement. It reports that the two accounts exist in conflict. What is clear is the scale and seriousness of her pivot away from performing. She built a substantial career as a sports media personality, co-hosting a daily sports talk show with a former NBA player, and grew into an ongoing identity as a commentator and one of the most followed personalities on social media. She launched a jewelry line, and she became a vocal advocate, describing what she views as exploitative recruitment practices in the adult industry, and campaigning through a petition that drew well over 1 million signatures to have her old material removed and her name and likeness returned to her control. That campaign drew a sharp public response from her former employer and remains, in some respects, unresolved. This book flags it as an ongoing dispute rather than a closed chapter. She has also become an outspoken commentator on Middle Eastern politics, immigrant identity, and women's rights. Estimates of her wealth circulate widely and come from unreliable sources. They are best treated as rumor rather than fact. What can be said with confidence is that Mia Khalifa took the most extreme version of the problem at the heart of this entire book. A brief, youthful chapter that the internet refused to let her outgrow, and responded by building a large, self-directed public platform and using it, loudly, to argue for more control over her own story. Whatever one makes of the disputes around her, that effort to seize back authorship of her own narrative is the very thing this book is about. Stoya. If Mia Khalifa represents the loudest version of the modern second act, Stoya represents one of the most quietly impressive, a performer who became a genuinely respected writer, published in some of the most prestigious outlets in the country. She emerged as a performer in the late 2000s and into the 2010s, but in the mainstream press she came to be known less for her film work than for her words. Under the byline Jessica Stoya, she has written op-eds and essays for the New York Times, The Guardian, Esquire, The New Statesman, and other serious publications. Not novelty pieces, but considered writing on sexuality, technology, ethics, and culture that stands on its own merits. Editors at major outlets did not run her work because of where she had worked. They ran it because it was good. Since 2019, she has co-written Slate's sex advice column, How to Do It, a steady, ongoing platform that has made her one of the most widely read advice voices in American media. It is a particular kind of authority, earned week after week by being thoughtful and useful to ordinary readers with ordinary questions. Few people from any background build that kind of trust with a mainstream audience. That she did it while carrying the industry's stigma makes it more notable, not less. She has also been an entrepreneur with a conscience, co-founding an independent adult content venture built around the idea of doing the work more ethically and giving performers more control. Part of a broader movement in her generation to reform the industry from within rather than simply leave it. Some of her early business ventures are documented more thinly than her writing, and this book leans on the well-established record of her journalism. As of recent reporting, she continues as a working writer and columnist. Her second act is a reminder that reinvention does not have to be loud to be real. She did not stage a dramatic exit or wage a public campaign. She simply wrote and kept writing until the byline that had once seemed improbable in the country's best publications became unremarkable. In a book full of bold pivots, hers is the power of sustained, serious work, the slow accumulation of a reputation, built one good sentence at a time. Jenna Haze. Jenna Haze followed a path that several of the most business-minded performers in this book would recognize, from in front of the camera to behind it, and then, on her own terms, to the exit. Born Jennifer Maria Corrales in Fullerton, California in 1982, she became one of the most widely recognized performers of the 2000s. Rather than remain solely a performer, she moved into directing and producing, launching her own production company, and taking creative and financial control of her work. The same owner, not just talent instinct that distinguished several of the entrepreneurs profiled earlier. It was a deliberate climb up the ladder from being filmed to being the one making the films. In early 2012, she announced her retirement from performing, sharing the decision directly with her audience through an online video and a press release, rather than letting it be reported around her. A small but telling sign of how performers in the social media age had come to control their own announcements. At the time, she expressed interest in continuing to work behind the camera as a director and producer. Her life since has been considerably more private, and the most detailed claims about it, including reports that she went on to study psychology with an eye toward a new profession, come from less authoritative sources, so this book presents them cautiously rather than as established fact. What is well documented and beyond dispute is the shape of her career arc: performer, then studio owner and director, then a clean and self-directed retirement. After that, by every indication, she chose privacy, and this book respects that choice rather than speculating to fill the silence. Hers is a fitting note on which to close the gallery of lives, because it captures, in miniature, so much of what this book has been about: the move toward ownership and control, the use of new tools to author one's own story, and finally the decision, as valid as any memoir or law degree or business empire, to simply step out of the public eye and live the rest of a life quietly, on one's own terms. Skin Diamond, Raylan Joy. Skin Diamond made one of the cleanest mainstream pivots in this entire book. She walked out of the industry and into a record deal. Born Raylan Joy Christensen in Ventura, California, in 1987, of mixed race and raised partly in Scotland, her parents were missionaries, and her father even appeared on a British children's television show. She became a distinctive, alternative-styled performer in the early 2000s. Then, in 2016, she retired and reintroduced herself to the world under her real name, Raylan Joy. The reinvention has been real, and it is thoroughly documented in the mainstream music press. She took an acting role in a Showtime series and then found her footing as a musician. She is now the lead singer of a ska punk band signed to Hellcat Records, the label associated with Tim Armstrong of the band Rancid. The band released its debut album in 2024 with singles covered by legitimate punk and music outlets, not industry trade press, but the regular music world, judging her on the music. That is the tell of a genuine crossover. She is no longer a former performer who also does music. She is the front woman of a touring band, written about by music critics on the same terms as anyone else. Of all the most recent figures in this book, hers is the cleanest evidence that the door out of the industry, for the determined, can open directly onto an entirely new stage. Afterward, what the second acts teach us. Lay these many lives side by side, and a few things come into focus that no single story could show on its own. The first is how stubbornly varied they are. We are trained to expect one of two endings from a story like this: the triumphant comeback or the tragic fall. And the lives in this book flatly refuse to line up behind either. There is a lawyer and a Guggenheim Fellow. There is a set of personal papers preserved at Harvard and more than one New York Times bestseller. There is a quiet retirement spent in graphic arts and a quiet career spent selling houses. There are genuine tragedies, real prison time, hard illnesses, and early deaths. And mostly, underneath all of it, there are people who did a great many different things with the decades they were given, exactly like everyone else. The variety is the truth. The neat arc is the lie. The second thing that comes into focus is how much those neat arcs leave out. Several of the performers here never actually left in the clean way the genre demands. They built radio careers and teaching careers and directing careers alongside the work, or they left and came back and left again. To tell their stories honestly is to surrender the satisfying single line and accept the truer, lumpier shape underneath it. That is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is the most human thing about these lives. The refusal of real people to behave like characters in a morality tale. The third thing is the sheer weight of stigma and the quiet courage it took so many of these people to carry it. Almost everyone in this book has described, in one form or another, what it is like to have a single chapter of a life treated as the entire volume. To walk into a job, a courtroom, a school, a neighborhood, and find that one old fact has arrived ahead of you and made up the room's mind. Some answered that by writing actual books and taking back the narration. Some answered it by earning degrees, founding companies, or simply showing up to an ordinary job and doing it well enough that the past gradually lost its power to define them. Some answered it by guarding their privacy fiercely and declining to perform their lives any longer for an audience that had already taken plenty. All of those are legitimate answers. None of them was easy. There is a temptation in a book like this to sort the lives into successes and failures, to keep a kind of scoreboard. That temptation should be resisted. The woman who became an attorney and the woman who quietly sold real estate are not in competition. The one who built an empire and the one who chose a private life did not win and lose. They made different lives out of different materials under a kind of pressure most of us will never face. And the measure of those lives is not how they would read as headlines, but how they were actually lived, day after ordinary day, long after anyone was watching. There is also a lesson here about the rest of us, about the people doing the watching, the remembering, and the forgetting. The stigma that shadowed every life in this book was not generated by the performers. It was generated by an audience that wanted what these people offered and despised them for offering it, that consumed their work in private and refused to acknowledge them in public, that was endlessly curious about their bodies and almost entirely incurious about their lives. To read their second acts honestly is to be confronted, a little, with our own habits, with how quickly we reduce people to a single fact, and how rarely we follow the story long enough to find out who they actually became. That, in the end, is why a book like this exists. Not to celebrate an industry or to condemn one, but to do the simple, slightly radical thing the culture so often refuses to do, to keep looking, to follow the trail past the famous moment and the forgotten aftermath, all the way to the human being on the other side. When you do that, when you actually trace these lives to where they led, the tidy categories fall apart and something more interesting and more true takes their place. Not stars and not victims, not triumphs and not cautionary tales, just people doing the long, hard, ordinary work of building a life out of whatever they were handed. If there is a single lesson in all of it, it is a modest and durable one, and it extends far beyond the particular industry these people happen to pass through. The most visible years of a life are not necessarily the most important ones. People contain far more than the one thing they were once known for. And reinvention, real, effortful, unglamorous, often invisible reinvention, is available far later and to far more people than we tend to believe. The cameras stop, the lights go down, and then, for very nearly everyone in these pages, the larger and better part of the story quietly begins. A word for the listener. If you have come to these stories as a listener rather than a reader, thank you for spending these hours in their company. There is something especially fitting about hearing these particular lives spoken aloud. So many of the people in this book spent their careers being looked at and almost never being listened to. They were images on a screen, faces on a box, names in a headline, rarely voices with something to say. To take in their stories through the ear as narrative is to restore a little of what the original fame took away, the sense of a whole person with a past and a future, a setback and a recovery, a life that did not end when the attention did. As you go back into your own day, you might carry one small idea with you. Every person you will pass, the cashier, the neighbor, the stranger on the train, is carrying a version of the same question this book has been asking. Each of them was something before and is becoming something next, and contains far more than the single thing you can see. The kindness this book tries to extend to its subjects is a kindness available to all of us, all the time, to assume the larger story and to leave room for the second act. This has been a Books by Barron production, the first volume in the Where Are They Now series. Look for more volumes to come, more fields, more famous and forgotten names, and always the same question. Where are they now? Let's keep finding out. Appendix: How the Industry Began. The people in this book did not invent the world they entered. By the time they arrived, the adult film industry already had a long, strange, and largely hidden history behind it. A history worth knowing because it shaped everything about the business these performers joined and the stigma they would later have to outrun. What follows is a brief, high-level account of how it all began and of some of the people who built it. Explicit film is very nearly as old as film itself. Within a decade or so of the first motion pictures, anonymous filmmakers in Europe were already producing what would later be called hardcore. Historians generally point to pre-First World War Europe for the earliest examples, though precise dating is almost impossible, because these films were made illegally, without credits, and without records. A French film from 1908 is often cited as the oldest that can be reliably dated, while a surviving Argentine film from somewhere around 1907 to 1912 is frequently called the oldest that still exists, its date guessed from the clothing and technology visible on screen. These competing claims should be treated as informed estimates rather than settled facts. In the United States, the oldest surviving example is generally said to be a short silent film called A Free Ride, also known as a grass sandwich, conventionally dated to around 1915 and credited as a joke to a pseudonymous A. Wise Guy. Even that date is disputed. Some film historians have argued it was made closer to the early 1920s, judging by the hairstyles on screen. A surviving print is preserved, fittingly, at the Kinsey Institute, the research body devoted to the study of human sexuality. These early films were known as stag films, and the name tells you how they were seen. They were short, cheap, silent, and black and white, and they were shown at men-only gatherings, stag parties, and smokers, held in fraternal lodges, private clubs, and back rooms. Traveling projectionists carried the reels from town to town. They were made and shown entirely underground, in large part because the Comstock Act of 1873 had criminalized sending obscene material through the mail, forcing the whole enterprise into the shadows, where it would remain for the better part of a century. The anonymity was not mystery for its own sake, it was a survival strategy. The genre began to inch toward daylight in the post-war decades, through a wave of low-budget films that tested how much the law would tolerate. In 1959, a filmmaker named Russ Meyer made a comedy called The Immoral Mr. Tease, built around non-sexual nudity for a tiny sum. It earned a fortune and launched a cycle of so-called nudie pictures. Meyer, who became known as the King of the Nudies and later made the cult favorite Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, eventually crossed over far enough to direct a film for a major Hollywood studio. Co-written with the film critic Roger Ebert, he proved decisively that sexually oriented films could be a real business. Other showmen of the era, working in both sex and violence, widened the path he opened. What truly changed the landscape, though, was the law. Across the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, a series of Supreme Court decisions slowly redrew the boundaries of what could be shown. A 1957 ruling discarded an old and sweeping Victorian standard and required that a work be judged as a whole by contemporary community standards. A 1969 decision held that simply possessing such material in the privacy of one's own home could not be made a crime. And in 1973, the court established the test that still governs obscenity cases today, giving the industry, for the first time, a clear, if demanding, legal framework it could actually operate within. The door did not swing fully open, but it was no longer locked. Into that opening stepped the films that defined the so-called Golden Age. The pivotal figure as a filmmaker was Gerard Damiano, a former hairdresser who in 1972 wrote and directed the picture that became a national sensation and gave the era its public face, and who followed it the next year with a more dramatically ambitious film that became one of the highest-grossing releases of its year. It was a New York Times Magazine writer who, in early 1973, popularized the phrase porno chic to describe the strange new respectability these films briefly enjoyed. A word of caution is in order here. The enormous box office figures and star-studded attendance stories that attach to this era are largely promotional legend, repeated far more often than they were ever verified. What is real is the cultural moment. The fact that, for a few years, such films were reviewed, discussed, and attended in the open. On the West Coast, two siblings, the Mitchell brothers, opened a San Francisco theater in 1969 and produced one of the era's landmark films in 1972, starring Marilyn Chambers, whose simultaneous appearance on boxes of a popular laundry detergent created exactly the kind of scandal that sold tickets. Their story would end in genuine tragedy 2 decades later, when one brother killed the other. A sobering reminder that the business was never as carefree as its publicity suggested. Other pioneers of the period included the producer behind one of the first plotted hardcore features to win wide theatrical release, and a European filmmaker, Italian by birth, who framed his explicit work as a campaign against censorship and pushed for higher production values. But the real money and power in the industry lay less in making films than in distributing them. The dominant figure here was a Cleveland businessman named Reuben Sterman, who built a vast national and international distribution empire and is often credited with popularizing the coin-operated viewing booth. For years, he beat back obscenity prosecutions, and the government finally brought him down, not on obscenity, but on tax and racketeering charges. He died in federal custody in the late 1990s. He is sometimes called, colorfully, the Walt Disney of his industry, a nickname that circulates widely, though the popular claim that the FBI itself coined it is not actually documented. The era's distribution networks were also entangled with organized crime, which drew sustained federal attention and a series of high-profile stings. The final great shift came with a machine, the home video cassette recorder. As VCRs entered American living rooms in the late 1970s and 1980s, the entire industry was remade. Films no longer needed theaters. They could be watched in total privacy at home. The audience expanded enormously. The adult theaters began to die, and production migrated from New York and San Francisco to the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, drawn by the crews, equipment, and talent of nearby Hollywood. One popular legend holds that adult films single-handedly won the format war between VHS and its rival. Historians are skeptical and credit VHS's victory mainly to lower prices and longer recording times, though adult titles were undeniably a large share of early tape sales. The lavish narrative film stock features of the Golden Age gave way to a high-volume world of video, and the stage was set for the generations of performers whose later lives fill this book. It is worth noting, finally, that women were present behind the camera earlier than the popular story usually allows. A handful of women worked as directors and even cinematographers in the exploitation and early hardcore years, and one former Golden Age performer, Candida Royale, profiled in these pages, is conventionally credited as the first woman to found her own adult studio in 1984. The history of this industry, in other words, contains more than the men who ran it. It always did. Appendix: The 5 Eras of the Golden Age. The people profiled in this book did not all enter the same business. The thing they joined changed shape dramatically across the decades, and the era a person came up in shaped almost everything about how their later life unfolded, including which doors stood open when their time in front of the cameras was done. It helps to hold the 5 eras clearly in mind. The first is the early 1970s, the brief window the press called porno chic. For a few years, a handful of explicit films broke out of the margins and into ordinary theaters, reviewed in newspapers and discussed at dinner parties. The performers of this moment often came from the theater and the arts, and a few were treated, however briefly, as genuine celebrities. It was the most respectable the industry would ever be, and it did not last. The second is the video boom of the late 1970s and 1980s. The home video cassette recorder took adult film out of the theater and into the living room. The audience exploded, production exploded with it, and a new kind of star emerged. No, not from theatrical features, but from tapes that millions watched in private. The fame grew larger and at the same time more anonymous. This decade was also shadowed by the AIDS epidemic, which turned questions of safety into matters of life and death. The third is the superstar era of the 1990s, when the business learned to manufacture stars on an industrial scale, and a few of them became true crossover celebrities, famous far beyond the trade, and increasingly sophisticated about treating their own names as brands and assets to be owned. The fourth and fifth eras belong to the internet. The early web disrupted the old ways of distributing films. Then, in the 2000s, social media collapsed the distance between performers and the public entirely, until a person could become globally known in days and narrate their own life in real time, with no studio or magazine in between. 5 eras, 5 different machines for making and unmaking fame. and 5 different sets of exits. The chapters of this book are organized along exactly these lines, because to ask where someone is now, you first have to understand the world they came from. About the Where Are They Now series. Where Are They Now is a series from books by Barron devoted to a single, irresistible human question. What happened next? We are surrounded by people who were, for a moment, the center of attention. The athlete whose record stood for a season. The one-hit wonder whose song still plays at weddings. The child star, the game show champion, the viral sensation, the scandal that led every newscast for a week and then vanished. The culture has an enormous appetite for making people famous, and an even larger one for forgetting them. This series exists to do the opposite, to follow the trail past the moment of fame and find the actual human being on the other side of it. Across its volumes, the series roams widely. It is not bound to any one field or genre. Future volumes will look at musicians and athletes, actors and politicians, inventors and entrepreneurs, the famous and the infamous, the celebrated and the merely briefly noticed. What ties them together is not what these people did to become known, but what they did afterward. The second acts, the quiet retirements, the reinventions, the comebacks, the cautionary tales, and the ordinary lives reclaimed against the odds. Every volume is built on the same principles. We work only from publicly available, published sources. We profile only people who have themselves chosen to be public about their stories. We do not expose, we do not speculate, and where the record runs out, we say so plainly rather than inventing an ending, and we approach every subject, however famous, however controversial, with the same baseline of respect, on the conviction that everyone contains more than the single thing the world remembers them for, a note on respect and language. A book on this subject could be written in many registers. It could be a leering catalog. It could be a finger-wagging sermon. It could be a clinical survey that drains the people of their humanity. This book aims to be none of those things. The first commitment is to treat every person here as a full human being rather than a category. The people in these pages have been described, for most of their public lives, almost entirely in terms of their bodies and their work. This book is interested in the opposite, in their minds, their choices, their families, their setbacks, their reinventions, and the long, ordinary stretches of life that no camera ever recorded. The second commitment is to restraint. There is nothing explicit in these pages. Descriptions of the industry and of the films are kept high level and brief, enough to establish who someone was and why they mattered, and no more. This is a choice about dignity, not squeamishness. The third commitment is to honesty, even when honesty is less flattering. Some of these stories include addiction, exploitation, prison, illness, suicide, and grief. Some of the cheerful narratives of clean exits turn out, on inspection, to be more complicated. Where that is the case, this book tells the complicated version, because a respect that requires airbrushing is not respect at all. Finally, a word about judgment. This book does not ask you to approve or disapprove of the industry these people worked in. People of good faith hold a wide range of views on that question, and it is not the subject here. The subject is what came after. And on that, the only attitude this book brings is curiosity and goodwill, a note on sources. This book is a work of synthesis, drawn entirely from publicly available published material. The principal sources for each profile included encyclopedic reference entries and, more importantly, the reporting and primary documents beneath them. the subject's own memoirs and official websites, profiles and obituaries in mainstream newspapers and magazines, broadcast and print interviews, archival collections, and documentary films in which the subjects participated and spoke for themselves. Among the published memoirs and books drawn upon are Linda Borman's Ordeal, Georgina Spelvin's The Devil Made Me Do It, Tracy Lords's Underneath It All, Christy Canyon's Lights, Camera, Sex, Secca's Inside Secca, Nina Hartley's instructional guide co-written with her husband, Candida Royale's How to Tell a Naked Man What to Do, Veronica Vera's book on her finishing school, Jenna Jameson's How to Make Love Like a Porn Star, and Tara Patrick's Sinner Takes All. Documentary sources included After Porn Ends and Desperately Seeking Secca, among others, and the archival collection of Gloria Leonard's papers held at Harvard University was a notable point of reference, where sources disagreed on a birth year, a film count, an exact dollar figure, or the chart performance of a record. This book either reconciled the discrepancy against the most authoritative available source or flagged the uncertainty directly in the text, rather than choosing a tidy but unverified number, where a subject's own account of events has been publicly disputed. As in the case of Linda Borman, both the account and the dispute are noted, and the reader is trusted to weigh them. Where reliable recent reporting simply does not exist, as with several of the more private figures in these pages, the text says so and declines to invent a present-day life on the subject's behalf. That last principle is the one this book takes most seriously of all. Everyone profiled here is a real person who chose, at some point, to speak publicly about their past. They are owed accuracy, and they are owed the dignity of not having details fabricated to round out a chapter or sharpen an arc. The aim throughout has been to honor the lives as they were actually lived, not to embellish them, not to sensationalize them, and never to reduce them to the single thing the world once thought it knew about them. This is the first volume in the Where Are They Now series from Books by Barron. Copyright and disclaimer. Copyright 2026 by Books by Barron. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law. A note on this book: it is a work of biography drawn entirely from published sources, and it profiles only people who have themselves spoken openly about their pasts. Nothing in these pages is explicit. A fuller note on the series, on sources, and on the approach taken here can be found at the back. First, the stories. This is the first volume in the Where Are They Now series from Books by Barron.